On June 28, 2024, Nike's stock price plummeted 20% in just one day of trading. $28 billion in market value vanished before most people even finished lunch, and that single company dragged the entire Dow Jones down by 41 points. All of that damage came from one brand and one famous swoosh. How does the most dominant sports brand in history lose its own game so badly? This wasn't just a single bad quarter or a run of bad luck. This was a massive identity crisis 5 years in the making, and while Nike was distracted, 3 scrappier brands were already moving in to steal the shelf space they left behind. To understand how Nike ended up in this mess, you have to look at what the company was actually built to be. Phil Knight didn't start Nike to sell shoes at the mall because he built the brand specifically for the serious runner. Knight was a middle distance runner at Oregon who trained under Bill Bowerman, a coach so obsessed with speed that he famously poured liquid rubber into a waffle iron just to create a better shoe sole. That obsession with performance and making athletes faster was the original DNA of the company. It wasn't about fashion or smartphone apps back then, because the athlete always came first and everything else was secondary. For decades, that focus on the athlete meant building a distribution network that reached every corner of the market. Nike sold through specialty running shops, massive department stores, and big box retailers to make sure their shoes were everywhere. This wholesale network acted like a protective moat that Nike spent 30 years digging, and it put their gear in every zip code and every income bracket through partners like Foot Locker and Dick's Sporting Goods. Everything changed in 2017 when the board of directors decided those partnerships were actually holding them back. They launched a plan called the Consumer Direct Offense, with a pitch that sounded perfect in a boardroom. By cutting out the middleman and selling directly to fans, Nike could keep all the profit, own the customer data, and control exactly how the brand looked. On paper, it looked like a masterclass in business strategy to move everything to their own apps and websites. The company started slashing ties with long-term partners, and suddenly Big Five, Zappos, and Dillard's were completely cut off. Nike walked away from distribution channels it had spent an entire generation building because the leadership bet they could replace all that sales volume through digital stores. For a while, the gamble seemed to pay off as direct-to-consumer revenue jumped from 30% of their business to nearly 45% after the pandemic. By 2022, their direct sales hit nearly $19 billion, and with millions of people joined up on the Nike app, the strategy looked like a stroke of genius. That's when they handed the keys to a new CEO named John Donahoe. Donahoe was a Silicon Valley operator who came from eBay and Bain, which meant he was a guy who thought in terms of platforms and data. The problem was that he wasn't a product guy, and he had never actually designed a shoe or managed the complicated relationships that keep a brand in stores. He didn't come from the world of sports. He came from the world of scaling tech companies. Under Donahoe, the plan shifted into high gear with the consumer direct acceleration, which meant faster cuts to retailers and even more money poured into algorithms. They built massive flagship stores and focused entirely on the digital flywheel, hoping it would spin so fast they wouldn't need the old ecosystem at all. Nike had the data and the profit margins to prove they were winning, but they were ignoring the one thing that actually mattered. John Donahoe's plan for Nike actually had a pretty logical flow to it. If you looked at it on paper, the idea was simple. Apps drive memberships. Memberships give you data. Data lets you personalize the experience, and personalization creates brand loyalty. It was a perfect, clean loop that probably looked incredible on a slide deck and definitely got a lot of applause at tech conferences. But here's the thing. Nike isn't a tech company. It's a brand built on the pull of its products, and that kind of pull requires a physical presence in the real world. You need to be in the stores and the cultural spaces where athletes and regular shoppers actually spend their time. When you gut the wholesale network that provides that presence, you aren't just losing shelf space, you're losing the daily reminder to the world that Nike even exists. Foot Locker was the first to feel the sting, followed quickly by Dick's Sporting Goods and local running specialty shops. These are the places where a serious runner goes to get fitted and talk gear with someone who actually knows what they're talking about. Yet they suddenly lost their Nike shipments. The moment those spots on the shelf opened up, Nike's competitors didn't wait around. They moved in fast with better stories, better profit margins for the store owners, and zero history of treating their partners like an afterthought. A shelf never stays empty for long. It just fills up with someone else's logo. While the retail side of the business was hollowing out, Nike's innovation department ran into a completely different problem. If you look at patent filings, Nike still leads the entire industry in sheer volume, but patents don't actually sell shoes to people on the street. You need visible, exciting performance products for that. And somewhere during this digital push, the flow of new running gear slowed down to a crawl. To fill that massive gap, Nike leaned on the classics like the Air Force 1, the Dunk, and the Jordan 1. These silhouettes have carried the brand for decades, and they still move units, so the business logic of leaning on them felt safe at the time. The problem was that this wasn't actually a strategy. It was a crutch. When you flood the market with the same 3 shoes for 4 years straight, 2 things are going to happen. First, your customers are going to get bored of seeing them. Second, retailers have to start discounting them just to move the boxes, which kills the resale value and teaches buyers to wait for a sale instead of paying full price. By the time Nike realized how much damage they'd done, they were sitting on a mountain of unsold inventory across all 3 franchises. They had to choose between a slow death or a fast one, and they chose to take the hit immediately. They cut the supply of Air Force 1 S, Dunks, and Jordans by 30 to 50% just to flush the system out. That one decision wiped out over $1 billion in revenue in a single quarter. Just let that sink in for a moment. Nike intentionally shrank its own business just to fix a disaster that its own strategy created. The leaders at the top didn't even try to hide what went wrong. Matt Friend, who served as CFO during the Donahoe years, admitted on an earnings call that while the digital push created new capabilities, it also added a ton of complexity and inefficiency. That's just corporate speak for we built something really expensive that didn't work. Massimo Junko, a marketing veteran who spent 20 years inside Nike, was much more blunt about it. He watched the brand through several different eras and eventually described Donahoe's playbook as reckless and unhinged. He argued that the leaders were chasing digital metrics that looked good in a vacuum, but were totally disconnected from what actually makes a brand healthy. He was right too. The app downloads and membership numbers looked great on a spreadsheet, but meanwhile, profit margins dropped by over 300 basis points. All that money they were supposed to save by going digital was eaten up by the massive discounts they had to offer just to keep the machine running. The high-margin digital future they promised never actually showed up. Instead, Nike ended up with a business that had insulted its partners, stalled its product pipeline, and built a digital infrastructure that cost more to run than the money it brought in. By late 2024, Donahoe was out. The board made the move quietly, but the timing of his exit was a loud admission that the Silicon Valley experiment had failed. While Nike was busy trying to be a tech company, 3 other brands were doing something much simpler. They were making shoes people actually wanted to run in, and putting them exactly where runners go to buy them. If you look back at what made Nike famous in the first place, it was 4 specific things: an obsession with performance, deep relationships with athletes, a massive retail presence, and constant innovation. Those 4 pillars built the empire. But while Nike spent 4 years trying to optimize a digital sales funnel, 3 other companies were quietly picking up the pieces that Nike had dropped on the floor. Let's start with On Running. 10 years ago, On was just a small Swiss startup making shoes with weird hollow pods on the bottom that looked like nothing else on the market. Back then, runners either loved the feel or thought they looked totally ridiculous. But today, that's not even a debate anymore. On brought in about $3.8 billion in revenue in 2025, which is a 30% jump over the previous year, and they're looking at even more growth for 2026. Their Cloud Monster and Cloud 6 lines didn't just sell well, they completely took over the conversation. If you walk through any big city right now and count the logos, you'll see them everywhere on serious marathoners and casual walkers alike. On built that fame the old-fashioned way by focusing on the product and picking the right retail partners. They didn't worry about an app, they just chased the runner and the runner followed. Then you have Hoka, and their story is just as bad for Nike's ego. Deckers bought Hoka back in 2012 when the brand was just a niche curiosity for ultramarathoners who needed giant cushioned soles to survive 100-mile races. At the time, nobody thought that clunky look would ever go mainstream, but they were dead wrong. Hoka hit $2.2 billion in revenue in 2025 and has been growing at a massive 42% every year since the buyout. The Clifton and Bondi models became the shoes that defined the category, And they didn't do it by outspending Nike on ads. They did it by solving a real problem for runners and letting word of mouth do the heavy lifting. When Nike started pulling its shoes off the shelves at big box stores, Hoka's sales teams were already standing there with products that people were specifically asking for by name. The void Nike left behind was filled by Hoka, one shelf at a time. New Balance is the third player here, and their success might be the most embarrassing for Nike because they didn't do anything radical. They just didn't make Nike's mistake. While Nike was burning bridges with wholesalers and betting the house on their own apps, New Balance stayed close to their retail partners and kept investing in both performance gear and lifestyle fashion at the same time. They let shoes like the 550 and 990 build up hype naturally through authenticity rather than trying to force it with an algorithm. The numbers speak for themselves, as New Balance hit $9.2 billion in revenue in 2025, which is a 19% increase. That's not just a lucky break. It's what happens when you stay focused while your biggest competitor is distracted. If you walk into a Fleet Feet or a Dick's Sporting Goods today, just look at what's sitting at eye level on the shoe wall. 5 years ago, that was all Nike territory, but now you'll see On and Hoka right at the front with New Balance close behind. Nike is now the one working hard just to earn back the spots they used to take for granted. Retailers don't lie about what's working because they put the stuff that sells at eye level and move the stuff that doesn't to the clearance rack. And for a while there, Nike was the one ending up on the clearance rack. Now Nike still controls about 25 to 35% of the global running market, so nobody is saying the brand is dead or irrelevant. But in business, market share is a number that tells you where you've been, while trajectory tells you where you're going. On, Hoka, and New Balance are all speeding up, while Nike just spent 2 years shrinking on purpose to fix a structural mess they made themselves. For anyone watching this who wants a career in sports or business, this is the most important lesson you can learn. You can optimize your profit margins on a spreadsheet all day long, but you earn a customer's loyalty on the shelf and in their daily routine. If you focus on the wrong one, your competitors will be more than happy to step in and take your place. When Elliott Hill walked back into Nike's headquarters in late 2024, he didn't need a map or an orientation packet to find his way around. He had already spent 32 years at the company, which meant he knew the culture, the product teams, and the athletes better than anyone else in the building. He understood exactly what the brand felt like before the Silicon Valley experiment started, and more importantly, he knew exactly what that experiment had cost the company. By bringing him back to replace Donahoe, the board was sending a loud message to every retailer and employee who had spent the last 4 years feeling uneasy, and that message was simple: the adults are back in the room. Hill didn't waste any time launching a turnaround plan he called Win Now, and the beauty of the strategy was that it wasn't complicated at all. He focused on simplifying the massive list of products, rebuilding the wholesale relationships Nike had ignored, and getting high-performance gear back into the innovation pipeline where it belonged. Part of the plan involved clearing out the old inventory sitting on the balance sheet, even if it meant losing money in the short term to get the decks clear. The goal was to stop treating Nike like a tech platform and start managing it like a world-class sports company again. If you look at the early data, you can see the plan is starting to work, though the recovery is slow and there is still plenty of pain in the numbers. Wholesale was the first area to bounce back, growing 8% in the second quarter of 2026 and another 5% the following quarter, which proves that retailers are happy to work with Nike again if they actually have products worth selling. The running category was a massive bright spot, with growth topping 20% for several quarters in a row, thanks to updated versions of the Pegasus and Vomero that actual runners wanted to buy. These aren't just vanity metrics to make investors happy, because running is where Nike lost its soul, so fixing that category is the only way to win back their credibility. However, the direct-to-consumer side of the business is still telling a much tougher story for the brand. Sales through Nike Direct dropped 9% in the second quarter of 2026 and fell another 4% in the third, proving that you can't just flip a switch and undo a 4-year strategy overnight. When you spend years building your entire digital system and membership perks around selling directly to people, trying to push that inventory back toward wholesale partners creates friction in every part of the company. By May of 2025, inventory was still sitting at a heavy $6.6 billion, And that mountain of shoes means Nike has to keep using markdowns and sales that eat away at the profit margins. Hill is trying to save. The honest scorecard for this reset is a bit of a mixed bag right now. Getting back into wholesale stores is the biggest win so far, and we can see that progress clearly in the way retailers are placing new orders. Innovation in the running category is finally moving in the right direction, and while inventory health is getting better, the company still isn't completely in the clear yet. Rebuilding the brand's reputation with athletes is happening, but the lifestyle hangover from the last few years isn't going to vanish in a single season. The biggest worry is the profit margin, because between new tariffs and constant markdowns, we probably won't see those numbers fully recover until late 2026 or even 2027. Hill himself described the situation as being in the middle innings, which you could see as refreshing honesty or a warning to investors to keep their expectations in check. There are also plenty of things Hill simply can't control, like the complicated market in China or the unpredictable costs that come with new tariffs. Meanwhile, hungry competitors like On, Hoka, and New Balance aren't going to hit the pause button while Nike tries to get its act together. These brands are moving fast by opening new stores and signing top-tier athletes, while Nike is still busy cleaning up the mess left behind by the previous leadership. If we're being honest, this is likely a 3 to 5 year rebuild rather than a quick fix, and anyone expecting a miracle overnight isn't looking at the reality of the situation. The truth is that Nike didn't lose its lead because the designers forgot how to make good shoes. They lost because the leadership forgot why people buy a sports brand in the first place. In this industry, you don't build a legendary brand by obsessing over channel optimization or digital funnels. You build it through product pull, which is what happens when a runner walks into a store and asks for a specific shoe because their training partner wore it and shaved a minute off their personal best. That kind of organic demand is what Nike spent 50 years building from the ground up. But during the Donahoe era, the company systematically traded that reputation away just so they could show off a higher percentage of direct sales and a prettier profit story on a spreadsheet. If you're interested in the business of sports, this era is a perfect case study because the failure followed a very specific and predictable pattern. It starts when you bring in an outsider CEO who understands tech platforms but doesn't have a gut feeling for the product itself. You give that CEO a strategy that looks amazing on a PowerPoint slide. Cut out the middleman, own the customer data, and keep all the profit for yourself. Then you start measuring success with metrics that only prove your own assumptions, like celebrating when app downloads go up or membership numbers grow. What you forget to measure is how much product is actually selling off the shelves at local running shops or how many new performance shoes you're making, compared to just recycling old classics for the 5th year in a row. By the time those real numbers turn ugly enough to cause a panic, 4 years have passed and your competitors have already stolen your lunch. There are 3 big lessons here that you don't need a fancy business degree to understand. First, your sales channel mix is what we call a lagging indicator. By the time your direct-to-consumer numbers look great in an earnings report, the real story has already been told by the empty shelves and the lack of excitement at local retailers. You have to watch the ground-level data first, because the fancy slide decks always come second. Second, those wholesale relationships are actually a massive defensive moat, not just a cost you should try to cut. Nike spent 3 decades building a retail web that put their gear in front of every type of person in every corner of the world. Then they spent 4 years tearing that web apart to save a few bucks, which basically handed that prime shelf space over to On, Hoka, and New Balance on a silver platter. You can't rebuild a moat like that in a single quarter. You have to earn that trust back one retailer and one season at a time. Third, the speed of your innovation is the actual heartbeat of the brand. If you slow down that heart, you don't just lose one sales cycle, you lose the entire conversation. While Nike was busy focusing on re-releasing old sneakers, Hoka took over the cushioning story. On claimed energy return, a New Balance became the brand for authentic performance. Nike stopped telling a story about the future and started managing inventory while pretending it was culture. Nike still has the best athletes in the world, the best factories, and a brand name that everyone on the planet recognizes. But being big is only an advantage if you're actually pointed in the right direction. The big question Elliott Hill has to answer over the next few years is whether a giant like Nike can still move fast enough to out-innovate smaller brands, or if their massive size has finally become a ceiling they can't break through. Nike spent decades writing the playbook for modern sports brands, but then they spent the last 4 years ignoring every single page of it. The empire isn't dead yet, but rebuilding that lost soul happens one product and one retailer at a time, and the clock is already ticking. Subscribe for more deep dives into the business of sports, and let me know what you think in the comments. Can Elliott Hill actually pull this off, or has Nike's greatest era already passed them by?